On the afternoon of September 23, 2007, the Miami Coast Guard responded to a report from Jeff Branham, owner of the fishing vessel Joe Cool. The boat had not returned from a trip to Bimini, the closest island in the Bahamas, located approximately 25 kilometers east of Miami. In principle, there was nothing unusual about the boat not returning on time. Passengers might get carried away with fishing or have a bit too much to drink and need to sleep it off, often asking the captain to stay out a little longer, which naturally leads to delays. Jeff Branham reported that 6 people were on board, 4 crew members and 2 passengers. It was an experienced team, typically helping tourists catch big fish, particularly tuna. However, the passengers this time were somewhat unusual. The 2 men were not interested in fishing at all. They had simply booked a one-way trip to Bimini. The captain was somewhat puzzled and directly pointed out that a short flight would cost them much less. Why book an expensive ocean trip instead? It turned out that the men could not fly because one of their girlfriends had accidentally packed his passport in her luggage. The girlfriends were now waiting for them on Bimini in another boat. The men agreed to pay $4,000 for the 2.5-hour journey. The captain was still unsure whether to take the job, but his uncle and co-owner of the boat, Jeff Branham, convinced him to accept. It was an international trip, which meant the company could later advertise trips to the Bahamas in its service offerings. Additionally, Jake and the crew could enjoy the opportunity to fish on their way back. On Saturday, September 22, 2007, the Joe Cool set off from the dock. Another very important trip was scheduled for the following day. The boat needed to be prepared in advance, so it was crucial for the crew to return on time. However, the next morning, when Jeff Branham expected to find the boat at the dock, it was nowhere to be seen. It was highly unlikely that the captain had intentionally extended the boat's stay at sea, knowing that other clients were waiting. Jeff called the port in the Bahamas and was horrified to learn that the boat had never arrived there. Since no issues on board had been reported, he found this extremely strange and contacted the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard began their search, and to better understand what might have happened on the boat, they investigated the crew members. All 4 crew members, Jake Branham, Kelly Branham, Scott Gamble, and Samuel "Sammy" Carey, were residents of South Florida. Jake and Kelly Branham were in their early 20s, a married couple raising 2 children. Their eldest daughter was 3 years old, and their youngest son was just 4 months old. Jake had dreamed from a young age of becoming the captain of his own boat, running fishing charters and tourist trips. Luckily for him, his family was very wealthy, and his grandfather provided the funds to purchase his first boat and set up the business. Jake acquired a 14-meter sport fishing vessel designed to handle rough seas. The boat was equipped with everything needed for tuna fishing, making it a top-notch vessel, perfect for catching big fish and hosting tourist trips. Jake's uncle, Jeff Branham, was listed as co-owner of the boat, while Jake's cousin assisted with administrative work. Jake's older brother, Scott Gamble, and a close family friend, Samuel "Sammy" Carey, joined the crew. By 2007, after just a few months in operation, the business was thriving, attracting many clients thanks to Jake's expertise in finding the best fishing spots. Kelly, Jake's wife, didn't always accompany the crew on trips. However, this short journey seemed too appealing to pass up. So Jake and Kelly asked Jake's grandfather to babysit their kids. At the scheduled time, the couple boarded the boat along with the rest of the crew and their passengers, and they set off on their voyage. The Coast Guard disseminated all critical information about the Joe Cool to nearby vessels, including a description of the boat, the number of people on board, and the purpose of its trip. Coast Guard patrol boats scoured the route the vessel was supposed to have taken, but there was no sign of it. They had no idea what might have happened to the boat. Other sailors, friends of the missing crew, joined the search effort. While the families of the crew members were undoubtedly worried, there was hope that everything was fine since Jake, Samuel, and Scott were highly experienced seamen. However, when the Joe Cool wasn't quickly located, an official search and rescue operation was launched. Helicopters took to the skies, and a plane flying the route between Miami and Bimini was also enlisted in the search. The likelihood of finding the Joe Cool was high, as the area was frequently patrolled due to its reputation as a corridor for illegal activities, such as the smuggling of migrants, particularly from Cuba, and contraband. Predictably, it wasn't long before sailors aboard a Coast Guard vessel spotted a fishing boat. However, all attempts by officers to contact the vessel went unanswered. As the ship drew closer, the crew saw the name on the boat, Joe Cool. It was indeed Jeff Branham's missing vessel, but the circumstances surrounding the boat baffled rescuers. The Joe Cool was drifting nearly 50 kilometers north of Cuba, about 225 kilometers off course. For a sport fishing vessel, there was no need to venture that far, expending unnecessary fuel to find fish. The mystery deepened when they noticed the boat's 23-meter anchor had been lowered. Even though the water was over 60 meters deep, the boat couldn't have drifted so close to Cuba on its own. This was perplexing, especially considering its original course. The route from Miami to Bimini crosses the Gulf Stream, which flows northward at a speed of 8-10 kilometers per hour. If the boat had encountered mechanical issues, the current would have quickly carried it north. For the Joe Cool to end up so far south near Cuba, someone would have had to deliberately steer it against the current. So someone had brought the boat to this location, and now no one on board was responding to the Coast Guard's calls to establish contact. In such a situation, one could imagine anything. Pirates might have been hiding in the cabin, for instance. Proceeding with great caution, the officers boarded the vessel. But the boat was, in fact, empty. However, something had clearly happened. The chaos that reigned everywhere and the presence of blood told its own story. Wallets, car keys, and other personal belongings were still there, indicating that the people on board had not intended to leave the boat in a hurry. Where were the 6 individuals who had been on the Joe Cool? Perhaps the missing lifeboat could hold the answer. The Coast Guard immediately began searching for the lifeboat. They worked against the clock as time was critical. Lifeboats are built to be sturdy, but the rescuers had no way of knowing the condition of the passengers and crew. Some or all of them could be injured, making every moment precious, especially as the weather began to deteriorate. Meanwhile, the Joe Cool was officially declared a crime scene. The Coast Guard called in the FBI, as crimes occurring on the high seas fall under their jurisdiction. 3 days had passed since Joe Cool left the port of Miami. On that day, a helicopter spent about an hour searching for the missing lifeboat when its crew spotted something orange floating in the water. It was the lifeboat. Its canopy was raised, but as the helicopter descended, the downdraft from its blades blew the canopy off. Inside the lifeboat, rescuers saw 2 people, out of the 6 who had gone missing. This was not a promising sign. The rescue team lowered a basket and brought the 2 individuals aboard the helicopter one by one. Due to the noise in the helicopter, communication with the survivors was conducted using a notebook and pen. The pilot handed them the notebook, asking what had happened and if they were okay. One of the men wrote, "West of Bimini, we were left in the boat, hijacking, 4 killed." The survivors were identified as the 2 passengers of Joe Cool, Guillermo Zaraboso and Kirby Archer. The men claimed that there was no one else left to rescue. They explained that 3 Cuban pirates had boarded the boat and killed all the crew members. After such a statement, the Coast Guard had no choice but to call off the search efforts. Meanwhile, officers continuing their work aboard the Joe Cool discovered 4 shell casings. This aligned with the fact that there were 4 victims. However, the crime scene was peculiar. It looked as though a hurricane had torn through the boat, yet nothing had been stolen. If pirates had attacked the vessel, it would make sense that they did so for money or valuables. But they hadn't stolen the boat itself, the $70,000 worth of fishing gear, the electronics, or the credit cards. Instead, they left behind odd items: an air gun, darts for it, handcuff keys, and even a shuriken. Objects considered weapons, which no one would reasonably bring on a pleasant fishing trip. This suggested the pirates had brought these items with them, but why would they leave them behind? Additionally, experienced seamen immediately noticed that whoever directed the boat against the current had done so ineptly, causing it to run out of fuel far too quickly. Pirates operating in the ocean wouldn't have made such a mistake. All these details raised serious doubts among the officers about the accuracy of the 2 survivors' story. The next step for investigators was to interrogate Guillermo and Kirby. If anyone had answers to their questions, it had to be these 2 men. Both recounted the same story. According to them, 3 Cuban pirates boarded the Joe Cool and immediately killed the captain. Next, they shot Kelly because she began to panic. The pirates then ordered the 2 other crew members, Sammy and Scott, to throw the bodies overboard. When they refused, the pirates killed them too. Guillermo claimed that the pirates then forced him to dispose of the bodies, a task he complied with in the hopes of being spared. He also said he tidied up the boat slightly under their orders. The pirates allegedly forced Kirby to take control of the vessel, abandoning their own boat as they set course southward for Cuba. The journey lasted about 8 hours until the fuel ran out. At some point, a 3rd speedboat appeared, and the pirates supposedly boarded it and sped away, leaving Guillermo and Kirby stranded in the middle of the ocean. The 2 survivors decided to move into the lifeboat, bringing their belongings, and attempted to make their way to shore. However, the neat story Guillermo and Kirby had crafted quickly unraveled when investigators began asking follow-up questions. For instance, when asked about the pirates' appearances and clothing, Guillermo described 2 young men and an older man who seemed to be the leader. According to him, the pirates wore polo shirts and jeans, but Kirby contradicted this, claiming the pirates were dressed in shirts and shorts. Their accounts also conflicted on the sequence of the killings. Guillermo stated that Jake was still alive when he was thrown overboard, while Kirby claimed that Kelly was the one still breathing at that time. The biggest inconsistency was their inability to explain why they abandoned a fully operational, well-equipped boat to climb into the lifeboat. The Joe Cool had all the necessary equipment to send a distress signal, which would have immediately brought help from the Coast Guard. By this point, investigators had a clear idea of who they should suspect, but they needed concrete evidence. Now the challenge was finding a way to keep the men in custody while building their case. First and foremost, investigators delved into the backgrounds of the two men, and they uncovered a lot of surprising information. Guillermo was just 18 years old. His family had moved to the United States from Cuba in 1999, and after winning the visa lottery, they settled in Florida. The young man still lived with his parents. He didn't drink, didn't use drugs, and had never had any issues with the law. Guillermo was known to be polite, social, and considerate. He worked as a security guard, but had always dreamed of becoming a police officer. In fact, Guillermo had applied to join the police force right before he and Kirby boarded the Joe Cool. Overall, everyone who knew Guillermo regarded him as a kind, generous, and thoughtful young man, and no one had a bad word to say about him. The past of 35-year-old Kirby Archer was far more eventful. His legal troubles began in 1993 when he was 22 years old. He had joined the Army after being accused of involvement in a crime involving a minor. The charge stemmed from the fact that his 15-year-old girlfriend hadn't returned home to her parents on time. In the Army, he worked for a long period as a military police investigator at the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base in Cuba. However, in 2003, he went AWOL, absent without leave, and was subsequently discharged from the Army. Kirby boasted that he simply chose the easiest way to leave the military, which he had grown tired of. After his discharge, he settled in Arkansas with his second wife and 2 children, but the couple soon decided to divorce. The breakup was extremely scandalous, as his wife accused him of having an affair with his own niece and fathering her child. Kirby denied any sexual relationship with his niece, but he did not deny being listed as the father on the child's birth certificate. Shortly after the divorce, Kirby became the subject of an investigation for child molestation. It's unclear whether the investigation was connected to his niece or whether it involved other matters, but the charges were serious enough that he was banned from seeing his own children unsupervised. Despite this, he eventually found love again and remarried for a 3rd time. In January 2007, about 9 months before boarding the Joe Cool, Kirby decided to test his luck. On January 26th, he went to work as usual. Kirby Archer worked as a customer service manager at a Walmart supermarket. At the end of his shift, he collected cash and checks, which was part of his duties. He then took the money, over $92,000, and the checks to a storage room. There, he took a new microwave out of its box, placed the money inside, and packed the microwave back into the box. After sealing it, he walked to the cashier, used his employee discount to purchase the microwave, and confidently walked out of the store. Kirby likely thought using his discount would make him look less suspicious, or perhaps he couldn't resist the chance to save a bit, even while stealing from his workplace. Either way, he knew the police would quickly catch up with him, so he fled. Kirby headed for sunny Miami. How did the young, law-abiding 18-year-old get involved with the 35-year-old criminal? Kirby met Guillermo in March or April of 2007. They had a mutual acquaintance, Carlos, who owned an auto repair shop. Guillermo had a strong interest in fast cars and enjoyed spending time around them. Meanwhile, Kirby had been telling Carlos that he worked for the CIA and had connections. Carlos, believing that someone with such connections could be useful to the young man who was passionate about becoming a law enforcement officer, decided to introduce them. Investigators began to piece together why 4 people were killed. The police believed that Kirby, who was facing serious charges, had never intended to go to Bimini. From the start, he had planned to turn the boat toward Cuba. Cuba has no extradition treaty with the U.S., and since he had once served in the military on Cuba and spoke Spanish, it would have been relatively easy for him to disappear and blend into the local society. There were many aspects that supported the police's theory. First of all, the pirates' behavior was completely illogical. It wasn't just that they didn't take valuable items. It was the fact that pirates typically don't kill people on a ship they're hijacking. 1 or 2 people might get hurt, but pirates generally try to spare everyone's life because word of mouth spreads fast. Every sailor would soon know that encounters with pirates inevitably end in death, meaning that when pirates attacked the next ship, the victims would fight back to the last man. Additionally, the police searched both Guillermo's and Kirby's homes. While they didn't find any weapons on the boat, which the criminals likely threw overboard, they were able to link the men to the weapon used in the killings. Since Guillermo worked as a security guard, he had a permit to carry a weapon issued by Florida. At his home, they found a receipt for ammunition matching the caliber of the bullets used in the fatal shooting. The men were arrested. They were informed that the police had enough evidence to prove their guilt, and the prosecution would insist on the death penalty for them. Fearing the death sentence, Kirby Archer decided to confess. He explained that he had bought a gun, and Guillermo had taken his own gun. Initially, the plan was simply to hijack the vessel and drop off the crew somewhere on the way to Cuba. The accomplices thought they would be accompanied by 2 crew members and did not expect there to be 4. However, the plans did not change. During the trip, according to Kirby, Captain Jake Brenham behaved strangely, so Kirby told Guillermo to wait for a signal. But the young man didn't listen and shot Scott and Samuel. Then Kirby shot the captain and his wife. Afterward, the accomplices disposed of the bodies and guns and headed toward Cuba, but they ran out of fuel. They had no choice but to board the lifeboat and hope that the Cuban Coast Guard would find them and take them to Cuba. Once on the lifeboat, they made up a story about a pirate attack. Since Kirby Archer decided to confess, the only thing left was to determine his punishment. With Guillermo, things were not as clear. It was unclear whether he knew about the plan to kill the crew members or if he had become the 5th victim and an unwitting accomplice to Kirby. In prison, he shared his version of events with another inmate, and he repeated the same version in court in 2008 when he took the witness stand. According to his account, Kirby had initially told Captain Jake Brenham that he had changed his mind and wanted to go to Cuba. Jake, of course, refused, and a heated argument ensued. While Guillermo briefly went to the bathroom, shots were fired. When he ran to see what was happening, he saw Kirby holding his gun. That is, Kirby had rummaged through Guillermo's bag and taken his pistol. He shot all 4 members of the crew. Then Kirby pointed the gun at Guillermo and forced him to throw the bodies overboard and clean up. After that, he started the boat and headed south, but after several hours, they ran out of fuel. Guillermo wanted to stay on the boat with his luggage until help arrived, but Kirby threw the luggage into the lifeboat and told Guillermo to get into it too. There, he came up with the story about pirates that they would tell the rescuers. Guillermo agreed to stick to it because he was afraid of Kirby. In court, he did not dispute that he had brought a gun aboard, but not for murder. He thought it would be necessary for the security work they would be doing. Guillermo believed they were going to do private security work in Bimini, and then he would accompany Kirby to Cuba for a mission with the CIA. He believed until the end that Kirby worked for the CIA and did not know that he was being sought by the police. He hoped that if he helped Kirby complete this mission, Kirby would help him get into the CIA. He passed 2 polygraph tests, and according to the polygraph examiner, he had not planned the murders. However, the prosecution did not believe in Guillermo's innocence, and they had at least one piece of evidence that the defense could not explain. The Coast Guard studied the GPS data on the Joe Cool and found that halfway from Miami to Bimini, the boat suddenly stopped. The engine was inactive for exactly 1 minute and 18 seconds before it was started again and directed south toward Cuba. That is, if we are to believe Guillermo, in just over a minute, Kirby managed to kill 4 people and intimidate his accomplice into obeying him unquestioningly and throwing the bodies overboard. This was hard to believe. Additionally, Carlos, the owner of the auto repair shop, who had introduced Guillermo and Kirby, took the witness stand. He knew about the original plan of the defendants, which initially involved hijacking a local speedboat, reaching the Bahamas, refueling, and then heading to Cuba. However, they were unable to steal a suitable boat, and a few days before the trip, they bought weapons because, as Kirby had told Carlos, they switched to Plan B. The jury deliberated for 4 days. They decided that Guillermo was guilty of causing death with a firearm, but could not find him guilty of murder. The judge later explained that the jury might have made such a contradictory decision because they believed that Guillermo did not kill the people, but was guilty because his weapon was used. It was clear that the jury was confused. The judge had to annul the trial. The prosecution tried to retry Guillermo in 2009. Guillermo continued to maintain his innocence, convinced that his actions were part of an undercover CIA operation. The evidence in the second trial against him was exactly the same as in the first trial, except that the police found something interesting on the young man's computer. It turns out that he had told his friends he was planning a trip to Cuba for a CIA mission and warned them that they might see his name in the news as missing. However, he never mentioned the trip to Bimini. Additionally, he made many search queries with the word Cuba, but only searched for information about Bimini once. According to the prosecution, this indicated that the young man had known from the very beginning that they were heading to Cuba. not the Bahamas. In the second trial, the prosecution succeeded in securing a conviction against Guillermo. He was found guilty on 16 charges. Both men were sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Still, the prosecution could never explain why Guillermo got involved in this venture. If Kirby really had a reason to flee to Cuba and was willing to do anything for it, even murder, Guillermo had no such necessity. Did he agree to participate in the murder of 4 people just for the faint promise of a job in the CIA from someone he barely knew? In any case, the men had a plan to escape to Cuba, but they did not account for the amount of fuel needed for such a journey or the difficulties of navigating the boat against the Gulf Stream. Fortunately, their inexperience at sea allowed both of them to be sent to prison for the rest of their lives. 4 people lost their lives entirely unnecessarily. To this day, the bodies of the 4 crew members and the weapon used to kill them have not been found.
They died in their own home. No signs of a struggle, no weapon, no motive. At first, the police assumed it was about money, but the deeper they dug, the clearer it became. Money had nothing to do with it. This case is about control, about a person who had been playing with other people's lives for years, and no one noticed. Their daughter had no idea that all this time she had been part of someone else's game. This is a story where one lie leads to dozens of others, like a domino effect. One falls, and everything collapses. And the deeper you go into this case, the stronger the feeling that there is no way out of this rabbit hole. 14 kilometers southeast of Colchester, in Essex, United Kingdom, lies the cozy Murcia Island, divided into 2 main areas, West and East Murcia. About 7,000 people live here, a small but close-knit community. As they say, everyone knows everyone. And how could it be otherwise when generations live in the same area, attend the same school, and go on to build families of their own? In 2023, the island was named the best place to live in the entire country. 61-year-old Stephen Baxter and 64-year-old Carol Baxter were not native to Murcia Island. They had moved here from a bustling metropolis. The couple were wealthy business owners who manufactured and sold bath mats under the brand Casplash. They purchased a luxurious home and, for a time, enjoyed life on the island. On Easter Sunday, April 9, 2023, Carol and Stephen's daughter, Elena Baxter, drove past her parents' house with her husband and child. She hadn't heard from them for 2 days, and it worried her. Since her mother hadn't been feeling well lately, Elena wanted to check on her. So she asked her husband to drive by the house just to make sure everything was okay. She immediately noticed the blinds were down. Her father would usually raise them as soon as he got out of bed. That struck her as strange. She went up to the door, but it was locked. No one answered her knocking or calls. So she went around the house and approached the conservatory. Through the glass, she saw her mother and father, and screamed in horror and grief. Her husband rushed over. Elena kept screaming hysterically, insisting they needed to break the glass. He tried to calm her down, suggesting her parents were simply asleep in their chairs. But Elena knew they were dead. Their posture and the color of their faces left no doubt. After breaking the glass, she entered the conservatory, where her last hope that her parents could still be saved was shattered. Elena called emergency services and a close family friend, Luke DeWitt. Luke lived just a couple of streets away and arrived quickly. His presence proved crucial. Elena was sobbing so hard that it was nearly impossible to understand her, so Luke answered the questions from medics and police. The only thing that could be made out from Elena's broken phrases was, she did something foolish." When the first emergency responders entered the conservatory, they found Carol and Stephen sitting in their favorite chairs. They were dressed normally, wearing shoes, and looked as though they had simply fallen asleep. There was not a single clue as to how they had died. No wounds, no injuries, no weapon, no empty pill containers, not even cups in front of them, and no sign of forced entry. For this reason, there was a suspicion of carbon monoxide poisoning. The police immediately evacuated neighbors and brought in a specialist to check for a possible gas leak, but the gas system turned out to be functioning perfectly. With that theory ruled out, the police were at a dead end. 2 people don't just die like that at the same time. There had to be a reason. The key question was whether a crime had even been committed. especially since Elena's fragmented statements hinted at another possibility. Elena, who had been crying uncontrollably the entire time, despite being 3 months pregnant, believed she knew what had happened. After calming down slightly, she explained that her mother had been experiencing health problems that caused her to do increasingly strange things. At first, they were relatively harmless. Carol might lay blankets out to dry on top of flowers outside or iron her husband's shirts on the kitchen stove. But later, her actions became alarming. She poured bleach into the kettle, nearly set the house on fire, and about a year earlier had been hospitalized with severe stomach pain. Doctors found a shoe nail in her stomach, something Carol couldn't remember swallowing. Naturally, the family was afraid to leave her alone, and someone was always with her, most often her husband, Stephen. Elena added that before discovering her parents, she had tried to contact her father, but he didn't answer, which made her increasingly worried. The phone found next to Stephen's body in the conservatory confirmed her attempts to reach him. Elena's brother and other relatives, upon hearing the news, rushed to the house. They confirmed that Carol's condition had recently been concerning, although she had once been an intelligent, sensible, cheerful woman, full of love for life. Their home had once been filled with music and laughter. Stephen and Carol loved dancing to their favorite songs in the kitchen. They married in 2000 and, even after 23 years, were still deeply in love. Once Elena had caught them kissing and giggled like a teenager. Her mother turned and said, "You're lucky your parents love each other." As she grew older, Elena came to understand the deeper meaning of those words and cherished her parents' relationship. Both Carol and Stephen had grown up and lived for many years in London. Stephen was an engineer who conducted building safety inspections and was well known in his field. He loved his family deeply and worked hard to provide for them. Carol was a mathematics teacher, but she was always full of ideas and had a determined, hard-working nature. If something came to mind, she wasn't afraid to pursue it. That's how she created a company selling unusually shaped bath mats. She had struggled to find the right mat for her shower and believed that if she was willing to pay more for a good design, others would too. That's how Kazplash was born. Stephen became her business partner, and the company proved profitable. Their success allowed them to leave the busy life of London and move somewhere quieter. That's how they ended up on Mercia Island, on the eastern coast of Britain. They had a beautiful, spacious home, expensive cars, and became members of a local yacht club. It seemed like they had everything to enjoy life. However, the family's happiness was overshadowed by Carol's condition. She had Hashimoto's disease, an autoimmune illness in which antibodies attack and gradually destroy the thyroid gland. It typically manifests as fatigue, weakness, and low energy, but with proper treatment, people usually remain functional and retain their zest for life. That was the case for Carol as well. She had been diagnosed with Hashimoto's many years earlier, but it only became a serious problem several years after the move to Mercia Island, where she once woke up at 6 in the morning and could accomplish a great deal by midday. She suddenly lost all her energy. By noon, she was already exhausted. And when your mind is full of energy but your body won't cooperate, it becomes a real torment. Carol consulted many doctors, including a thyroid specialist, trying to understand what had changed. But essentially, the only conclusion they reached was some form of anxiety disorder. Meanwhile, Carol's symptoms went beyond fatigue. She began behaving strangely. She forgot the names of loved ones, couldn't remember what she had done the day before, and overall seemed as though she might have dementia, Parkinson's disease, or even had suffered a stroke, though none of those diagnoses applied. About a year and a half before her death, Carol became especially determined to understand her condition. Frustrated by doctors' inability to give her answers, she grew increasingly desperate, searching for anyone who could provide clarity. Refusing to accept the doctor's helplessness, proactive Carol created an online support group for people with Hashimoto's. Together, they discussed treatments, doctors, and supported one another. Among other things, they talked about a revolutionary method by an American endocrinologist, Andrea Bowden. Carol tried to contact her, but without success. Then, on February 23, 2022, Dr. Bowden unexpectedly emailed Carol herself. The doctor had a relaxed, informal tone. She assured Carol it wasn't a scam and that she was indeed writing from sunny Florida. Carol, of course, replied, and this marked the beginning of an intense correspondence. They exchanged several emails a day, and Dr. Bowden affectionately addressed her patient as Honey. This communication seemed to help Carol. She became more upbeat after connecting with the endocrinologist. While previous doctors had insisted she was fine, Dr. Bowden agreed that Carol was seriously ill and provided a list of steps that would supposedly guarantee her recovery. Nothing seemed impossible. More rest, light exercise, healthy smoothies alongside medication. Carol also needed to be filmed regularly so the doctor, being in Florida, could monitor her condition remotely. By April of 2023, the family had grown so close to Andrea Bowden that Elena called her among the first when she discovered her parents dead. The doctor expressed her condolences, but when the police later tried to contact her for an expert opinion on Carol's condition, she did not respond. Through the same Hashimoto's group, Carol befriended another patient named Linda. They corresponded frequently, and Linda repeatedly emphasized how important it was to strictly follow Dr. Bowden's instructions. It's worth noting that members of the group mostly communicated through messages. Carol really wanted to meet them via video calls, but it never quite worked out. Eventually, she insisted on meeting Linda and her husband in person. Stephen drove his wife for 3 hours to a hotel where the meeting was arranged, but Linda never showed up. Sometime later, it was reported that Linda had died, partly because she had failed to follow Dr. Bowden's rules. This deeply affected Carol. It was as if she had aged 10 years overnight. She seemed ready to give up. This frightened her family. They had never imagined someone could die simply by not following certain rules. So they became even more vigilant, making sure Carol drank all her prescribed smoothies and got plenty of rest. They were desperate. This felt like their last hope. When Carol's condition worsened, Stephen didn't know what else to do. He helplessly watched the woman he loved deteriorate, hoping that following the instructions would somehow make a difference. And then Carol died. But how? And why did Stephen die as well? The police still couldn't find answers. There were no wounds, no injuries, no injection marks, nothing suggesting involvement of a third party. So investigators sent blood samples for laboratory analysis. Meanwhile, not wanting to lose time, they began questioning neighbors. As you may remember, the island is small. Everyone knows everyone, and they talk. Without waiting for official conclusions, neighbors began to suspect that Elena, the couple's daughter, was somehow involved in what happened. They knew Stephen and Carol rarely argued, but their children had more volatile personalities and sometimes clashed with their parents. Elena herself admitted that she and her brother didn't always behave perfectly, but that happens in any family. This case became even more puzzling because of Stephen and Carol's will. When forensic investigators finished their work and the family was allowed back into the house, Elena wandered through the rooms in a daze, unsure where to begin. A close friend advised her to start with documents, especially to find out which banks her parents used, so she could understand their finances. That's exactly what she did. And as she went through one of the folders, a sheet of paper fell out. It was a will, but a strange one. First of all, it wasn't a formal document prepared by the family's lawyers. Previously, the couple had created detailed multi-page wills describing all their assets, business, and savings. This one, however, focused solely on their company, Kazplash, the bath mat business. According to the document, in the event of both spouses' deaths, 100% of the company would go to Elena, and she would be assisted in running it by Luke DeWitt, a close family friend and the company's technical specialist. To the police, this seemed highly unusual. Elena and Luke were set to receive everything, while Elena's brother and Carol's 2 children from a previous relationship were left with nothing. Investigators contacted the lawyer who had drafted the previous will, and he had no knowledge of this document. His firm had not been involved. The sheet was clearly a forgery, and not a particularly convincing one. Up until that point, Luke had seemed like nothing more than a kind-hearted neighbor. But now detectives became interested in his role in the family. Luke DeWitt was a 33-year-old programmer who had lived on the island his entire life. He lived with his mother just a couple of streets away from the Baxters. Locals knew him well. He helped at town carnivals and festivals and was generally seen as a modest, friendly person always ready to help. He met the couple about 10 years earlier, when they needed someone to build a website for Kazplash. He did an excellent job and gradually became one of the company's most trusted and reliable employees. When Carol's health declined significantly about 2 years before her death, Luke essentially took over running the business. He grew especially close to the family after his father died of cancer in 2021. Around that time, he decided to improve his own health. He started going to the gym with Carol and lost a significant amount of weight. He also prepared the healthy smoothies that were supposed to help her condition. Carol was very fond of him and treated him like a son. Elena, who had known him since her teenage years, relied on him like a brother. He was the first person she called after discovering her parents' bodies. But given their close relationship and the appearance of a clearly forged will naming only them, both now became persons of interest for investigators. Even then, the police were not entirely certain a crime had been committed. The fog began to clear on June 29, 2023, 3 months after the bodies were discovered, when the toxicology report finally arrived. At the time of his death, Stephen had a fatal dose of fentanyl in his blood. Carol, meanwhile, had both a lethal dose of fentanyl and the antihistamine promethazine in her system. Now investigators knew how the couple had died. However, many questions remained unanswered, such as where the fentanyl had come from. Unlike in the United States, where it is at the center of the opioid crisis, fentanyl is less widespread in the UK, though it is prescribed in certain medical cases. Police also didn't know whether the couple had obtained it themselves or if someone else had supplied it. But one thing was clear: the case was now officially a double murder investigation, and the suspects had been identified 3 months earlier. To avoid alerting potential accomplices, police arrested Elena and Luke simultaneously. Elena was horrified when she was told that her parents had indeed been murdered, and that she herself was being arrested on suspicion of killing them. Losing her parents was one thing, but learning they had been murdered while she was 7 months pregnant was an entirely different level of nightmare. Luke appeared calmer, though he too had not expected the arrest. At the station, Elena heard Luke's voice and asked detectives to be gentle with him. He wasn't used to situations like this. Elena was questioned several times, and her phone was examined, but no evidence was found linking her to the murders. She was released on bail. Luke was not. And Elena couldn't understand why. He couldn't possibly be involved. Of course not. This was Luke. The police must be mistaken, she thought. She kept believing that, even after fentanyl was found in his possession. When Luke DeWitt was arrested, he was searched, and fentanyl was found in his bag. He claimed the medication had belonged to his father, who had died of cancer 2 years earlier. He said he had packed it while sorting through belongings at home, and later added his grandfather's medications as well. He intended to return them to a pharmacy, but never got around to it. Meanwhile, officers searched the house where Luke lived with his mother, and struck what could only be described as a goldmine of evidence. They found a large quantity of various medications, opened capsules, syringes, a mortar and pestle with traces of crushed pills at the bottom, and fentanyl patches. Most importantly, they discovered 4 capsules filled with crushed promethazine. This was significant because promethazine was the second substance found in Carol's body. Although promethazine is typically used as an antihistamine, it can also act as a sedative. In cases of overdose, it can produce symptoms resembling Parkinson's disease, just as Carol had experienced in the months before her death. Even more disturbing, among the medications were shoe nails, similar to the one that had been found in Carol's stomach about a year earlier. Previously, given her condition, everyone assumed she had swallowed it herself in a confused state. But now investigators suspected that Luke had placed the nail inside a capsule, sealed it, and given it to the trusting woman to swallow. What puzzled investigators, however, was why he hadn't disposed of the evidence, even after 3 months, but instead kept it in his home and in a bag he carried around. During questioning, Luke responded to most inquiries with no comment. He remained outwardly calm. But detectives were not fooled. They were convinced he was involved, though the motive and exact method were still unclear. Did he act alone? How had he administered the fatal dose of fentanyl? In what form? And was anyone else present? Because Luke had been preparing the smoothies and cocktails recommended by Andrea Bowden, police were eager to speak with her. But their attempts failed. They couldn't reach her, and couldn't even find reliable information about her. It was as if she didn't exist at all. By this point, investigators were ready to charge Luke, but were still uncertain about Elena's involvement. She behaved exactly as one would expect in such a situation, but what if she was a good actress? The answer lay in their phones. After reviewing their communications, investigators concluded that Elena had nothing to do with her parents' deaths. Meanwhile, the evidence against Luke kept growing like a snowball. Police examined not only Elena's phone but all of Luke's devices, 18 mobile phones and 10 laptops. It took months to analyze all the data. Among mostly harmless materials, like flyers for local carnivals, they discovered something critical: the email account of Dr. Andrea Bowden, used to communicate with Carol. An officer traced the correspondence back to its very beginning, February 23, 2022. That meant one thing: Luke had been posing as Andrea Bowden from the very start. This revealed an entirely new level of deception. Luke wasn't just a killer. He had impersonated a doctor to control and manipulate Carol, and even, to some extent, her entire family. Or rather, not just to some extent. As officers dug deeper, it felt like falling further into a rabbit hole. They began to understand the full scale of Luke's manipulation. Elena had a beautiful voice and loved to sing. At one point, Carol shared a video of her daughter's performance with members of the Hashimoto's group. One of them, Cheryl, was amazed and said her sister, Jenny, was a theater director who could help Elena. Soon, Jenny contacted Elena, claiming she and her friends had launched a new agency for vocalists. She encouraged Elena to send recordings. Over time, their professional interaction turned into a friendship, despite never meeting in person. Jenny supported Elena even after her parents' deaths, advising her on funeral arrangements. It was also at Jenny's suggestion that Elena searched through documents, leading her to the fake will. Since Cheryl and Jenny had supposedly been close to her mother, Elena invited them to the funeral, but she had never seen them in person. So she asked Jenny to send a photo. Jenny promised, but never did. After the funeral, Elena asked Luke whether they had come. He replied that they had, but had to leave early due to Cheryl's medical appointment. It seemed a bit strange, even rude, but Elena didn't dwell on it. After Luke's arrest, she tried to contact Jenny again. She never replied. By then, however, the police already knew the truth. Elena herself had been manipulated. On Luke's devices, they found not only Andrea's account, but also accounts for Jenny, Cheryl, and even Linda, who had supposedly died earlier. Although investigators couldn't reveal everything, their questions led Elena to piece things together herself. The realization came like a domino effect. If Jenny wasn't real, then neither was Cheryl. And Cheryl had been in the same group as Linda, who had died, and all of them knew Dr. Andrea Bowden from Florida. Elena had believed they were interacting with multiple families, but in reality, it had all been one person: Luke DeWitt, Cheryl, her husband, and their children. Fiction. Jenny and her family. Fiction. Linda and her husband. Never existed. Elena began to grasp the horrifying truth of what her family's life had been for years. Police later estimated that Luke had created around 20 different identities, using at least 7 of them to communicate with Carol, Stephen, and Elena. Some personas were specifically designed to isolate Carol from her children and prevent her from seeking real medical help in the UK. On Luke's phone, officers found not only numerous accounts and email addresses, but also audio recordings of him practicing a female voice. Detectives were stunned by the level of detail. He had constructed entire lives, entire families, and no one suspected him. He had been a trusted family friend for so long that he operated without question. Still, if anyone might have begun to suspect something, it would have been Stephen. Some of his messages showed growing doubts about the existence of certain patients of Dr. Bowden. Yet even he likely couldn't have imagined how far Luke's deception went. Stephen still believed in Andrea Bowden herself. At one point, he confided to her that Luke sometimes overstayed his welcome, and that he and Carol needed a break from him. The response from Dr. Bowden turned aggressive. She accused Stephen of being a bad husband who didn't care about his wife. Immediately, the so-called support group joined in, pressuring Carol. These messages were sent just 2 days before the couple's deaths. Luke attacked them through his fabricated identities, mocking, pressuring, manipulating. It was cruel, and yet it seems that if anyone could have uncovered the truth, it would have been Stephen. He was intelligent and might have eventually connected the dots. The timing, the coordinated responses, the pattern of manipulation, but the killer never gave him that chance. But how did Luke DeWitt manage to get fentanyl into Stephen's system? Carol was one thing. She had grown used to taking food, drinks, and medication from his hands, but Stephen was different. He was capable of taking care of himself. Late in the investigation, while examining Luke's devices, police uncovered yet another identity, Alan Mandel. The email account had been created on March 31st, 2023, just a week before the couple's deaths. Stephen had liver problems, and although he wanted to improve his health, he usually avoided medication. Dr. Mandel promoted a liver cleanse program as a natural way to restore health without traditional drugs, most likely to support her husband. Carol signed both of them up for this program. The doctor sent instructions. Mix half a cup of hot-boiled water, a teaspoon of lemon juice, and 3 dissolved aspirin tablets. Carefully, he added, if you're not sure you can do it correctly, stop and ask a friend to help. That friend was almost certainly Luke. Police knew he had been at their house on April 7th. He himself had said so early in the investigation. Investigators believe he took that opportunity to add fentanyl to the supposed liver cleanse drink. Both spouses consumed it. Dr. Mandel had warned Carol that dizziness might occur, and that it was normal. At 10:42 a.m., and Carol messaged the doctor saying her husband felt dizzy. The reply came quickly, a joke, cheaper than alcohol, with a smiley face. Both Dr. Mandel and Andrea Bowden communicated casually, almost like friends. In another situation, this might have raised suspicion. But who could imagine such an elaborate deception? The cruelty didn't end there. Luke was physically present in the house, answering Carol's messages as Dr. Mandel while standing random with her. Even that wasn't enough for him. Police found photos on his phone taken hours after the couple drank the mixture. In them, Stephen and Carol are seen sitting in chairs in the conservatory, already unconscious but likely still alive. Luke had left one of his phones behind, pointed at them. He could go anywhere while watching their final moments remotely. He withdrew several £1,000s from Carol's account, and then he left. Where did he go? To celebrate Elena's birthday, the daughter of the 2 people he had just poisoned. He told her her parents were resting, so she didn't call or disturb them that evening. Later, around 8 p.m., he returned to the house. He retrieved his phone, washed the glasses used for the cleanse, locked the door, and calmly went home. When Luke was arrested, the residents of Murcia Island were horrified. Many believed the police had made a mistake. No one could believe that such a polite, helpful young man could commit something like this. The trial began on February 14, 2024. In court, Luke appeared in a wheelchair, claiming he had a growth on his leg. But he provided no medical evidence and refused to give prosecutors access to his records, likely because he hadn't visited a hospital in years. This seemed to be an attempt to gain sympathy. He denied murdering the couple, and then delivered one final blow to the family, claiming that Stephen himself had asked him to create all the fake identities, supposedly to encourage Carol to follow treatment. It was a disturbing claim, one that felt like a final act of cruelty. Luke was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 37 years before he can apply for parole. Police and prosecutors never established a clear motive. At first, they suspected financial gain, but that theory didn't hold. The hastily forged will fooled no one and seemed designed only to cast suspicion on Elena. This wasn't about money, nor did it appear to be simple sadism. Stephen and Carol did not suffer. They effectively died in their sleep. Most likely the motive was control, a cold desire to manipulate, to dominate, to rewrite reality. Luke DeWitt didn't just kill Stephen and Carol. For years, he rewrote their lives, turning them into a scenario where he played every role himself. And the most frightening part? No one noticed. Not the family, not the friends, not even Carol. And perhaps that's what makes this story truly disturbing. Not that a killer could be nearby, but that he could be the one person you trust completely. Elena still has a video she recorded for Dr. Bowden. She was filming her mother, but in the frame, Luke can be seen typing on his phone. At that exact moment, Elena received a message from Andrea Bowden. Luke was texting her, pretending to be the doctor, while she filmed her mother for someone who didn't even exist.
May 18, 2006. The owner of a recreational boat was heading toward Santa Catalina Island, a rocky island in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of California. As he traveled, the man noticed seagulls circling over something in the water. There were many birds, screeching in a frenzy. Suddenly, he realized there was a body floating in the water. That was what had attracted the persistent birds. The boat owner immediately contacted the Coast Guard, who in turn called the sheriff's office. A heavily decomposed body was pulled from the water. It was in terrible condition. The only certainty was that it belonged to a human. The person was fully clothed and, based on the attire, appeared to be a man. However, his face was disfigured after prolonged exposure to the water. The body was found in an area frequented by international shipping lanes. These lanes are used by vessels delivering goods and passengers to the port of Los Angeles from all over the world. This led to the plausible assumption that the man had been aboard one of the cruise ships or cargo vessels. It seemed likely the poor soul had fallen overboard and drowned. The body was taken to the coroner's office, initially classified as a drowning victim. However, during the autopsy, the medical examiner discovered a bullet lodged in the deceased's head. The angle of entry made it clear that the victim was unlikely to have shot himself. The police launched a homicide investigation, with the first priority being to identify the John Doe. The deceased was fully dressed, even wearing gloves. When the medical examiner removed them, he found that the man was missing 3 fingers on his left hand. The fingers had not been eaten away by marine life. They had clearly been surgically amputated many years earlier. But no missing person reports in Los Angeles County, nor on the peaceful Santa Catalina Island, mentioned an individual with amputated fingers. The victim had been wearing fairly expensive shoes, indicating that he was unlikely to have been a crew member on a ship. More likely, he was vacationing or owned his own boat. Attached to the shoes were barnacles, calcium-based shells belonging to small marine crustaceans. A specialist identified them as gooseneck barnacles, a species found only in specific areas, including the backside of Catalina Island. This evidence suggested that after the man was killed, his body had entered the water near the backside of Catalina Island. By analyzing the varying sizes of the gooseneck barnacles, the specialist also estimated that the body had been in the water for approximately 15 days. However, it was unusual for a body to remain in the same area of the ocean for so long unless weighted down. Why hadn't it drifted further out to sea? This anomaly was explained by a weather phenomenon unique to the Southern California Bight: circular water currents. These currents trap objects, spinning them around the island. Thus, instead of being carried away into the open ocean, where the body might never have been found, it was caught in one of these currents. This whirlpool effect eventually brought the body to the front side of Catalina Island, where it was discovered. For a week, the police struggled to identify the victim. Then a man reached out to the detectives, worried about his missing friend. Having heard news reports about the discovery of a body, he feared it could be him. When the detective asked for distinguishing features, the man immediately mentioned that his friend had lost 3 fingers on one hand in a woodworking accident during school. This couldn't have been a coincidence. The body was identified by family members as 59-year-old Stephen Bailey Williams, a former radio DJ who had lived in San Pedro. The police began interviewing Stephen's friends and relatives to understand how he ended up near Santa Catalina Island. Stephen Bailey Williams, also known to fans as Stephen B., possessed extraordinary charisma and a magnetic voice, deep, resonant, and captivating. These qualities earned him a job on the radio, where he co-hosted a popular morning show in Denver. For many years, the show enjoyed tremendous success. Eventually, the station decided to move in a new direction, and there was no room for Stephen. As someone deeply passionate about his work, he struggled to accept being let go. Still, he didn't give up. He enrolled in culinary school and began crafting meals perfectly paired with specific wines, excelling in this new pursuit. Around 2001, Stephen's father's health deteriorated, and he moved in to care for him. For 2 years, Stephen devoted himself to his father's well-being. When his father passed away, he left Stephen a substantial inheritance, nearly $2 million. This windfall came just 3 years before Stephen's body was found. A new millionaire should have been enjoying life, but instead, Stephen lay lifeless on the coroner's table. Stephen found it challenging to manage the sudden wealth and the myriad bills that came with it. His friends described him as a creative and immensely talented individual, but one who was far from savvy with finances. Stephen could even forget, entirely in earnest, to pay his taxes. In September 2003, a close friend visited Stephen's home, bringing along an acquaintance named Harvey Morrow. Harvey was a former Wall Street financial advisor. His keen eye quickly noticed the unopened mail and the pile of bills on Stephen's table. During their conversation, Harvey realized that Stephen was overwhelmed and struggling to manage his affairs. Harvey offered to help untangle the mess. To Stephen, it seemed like Harvey was heaven sent, a guardian angel stepping in to save him. Grateful, Stephen entrusted Harvey with the management of his accounts and financial documents. Stephen's friends were happy for him until they realized that things were not as perfect as they seemed. Stephen regularly dined with his friend Sylvia Nolan. In 2005, they met once again in a restaurant, but Stephen didn't have the money to pay for his meal. He was very embarrassed. Sylvia paid the bill and wanted to lend him some money, but he refused. Sylvia, as a close friend, asked Stephen directly, "How can you have no money? You inherited $2 million and you can't afford to pay for your food?" Stephen replied that Harvey had put his money into an offshore account. It would remain there until he and Harvey withdrew it together. Sylvia remembered that someone had recently broken into Stephen's car and stolen various documents from the trunk. She asked if any of the stolen papers included a contract stating that Harvey would manage his finances. "What contract?" Stephen asked, surprised. His friend was shocked. Stephen had handed over nearly $2 million to someone he barely knew without even requesting any written agreement. Stephen's friends tried to reason with him and pointed out that something seemed suspicious about Harvey. But Stephen always brushed off their concerns. Things escalated to the point where Stephen was left with no means of livelihood at all. The last time a friend tried to talk to Stephen was in early May. They asked directly what Stephen planned to do about the situation. Stephen finally admitted that he needed to speak with Harvey, demand answers, find out where his money was and how he could access it. "I will get answers to these questions," Stephen assured his friend. After that, he disappeared and was never seen alive again. The police obviously needed to talk to Harvey Morrow, and they knew where to find him. Harvey had recently acquired a beautiful yacht, which he was meticulously refurbishing. It was a luxurious 22-meter vessel, suitable even for a round-the-world journey. Shortly after Stephen and Harvey met, the yacht began transforming as if by magic. Teakwood decking, large TVs, fireplaces, a gourmet kitchen, art pieces, a new navigation system, and stainless steel railings. The yacht was undergoing spectacular changes. Oddly enough, Stephen was enthusiastic about the yacht's renovation. He told his friends that Harvey planned to set sail around the world on the yacht with his wife Deborah. Harvey had invited Stephen to join the crew as a chef. Stephen eagerly agreed, and in November 2003, he moved aboard the yacht. He planned to take additional courses to qualify as a yacht chef. The voyage was expected to begin in 2 or 3 years, once the renovations were complete and the yacht was stocked with supplies and equipment. Incidentally, the yacht was the last place Stephen was ever seen alive. On May 25, 2006, 7 days into the investigation, detectives obtained a search warrant and headed to San Pedro, where the yacht was docked. However, the yacht was empty and immaculately clean, as though no one had ever lived there, despite detectives knowing that Stephen had resided on the vessel. Officers searched for evidence linking the deceased to the yacht, personal belongings, perhaps blood, but found nothing. They were also interested in the vessel's electronic equipment, especially the GPS device. Unfortunately, all they found was the user manual for the GPS navigator. The device itself was missing, which was particularly disappointing because GPS systems record and store all movements made by the vessel. Detectives were eager to find it, as it could immediately reveal whether the yacht had been near the island where Stephen's body was discovered. Finally, the officers found an expense ledger in which Harvey had recorded how much money he had spent refurbishing the yacht, over $2 million, roughly the same amount Stephen had inherited. It appeared that Harvey had used Stephen's money to make his luxurious yacht even more opulent, while Stephen was left penniless. The police left the yacht almost empty-handed, frustrated that they hadn't caught Harvey. However, employees of the yacht club informed them that they hadn't missed him. In fact, Harvey had been there, but as soon as he saw the police, he jumped into his car and sped away. An innocent man wouldn't run, confirming that detectives were on the right track. The hunt for the suspect began. The police contacted Harvey's mobile carrier and discovered that after leaving Los Angeles, Harvey had driven to Las Vegas where the trail went cold. He had destroyed his phone. Further analysis confirmed that both Harvey and Stephen had been on the yacht on the day of the murder, May 4th, 2006. That day at around 1 p.m., Stephen called Harvey's phone. Cell tower data showed Stephen's phone pinging from near the Los Angeles port, but later, around 4 p.m., both phones were together, pinging from a tower on Santa Catalina Island. Experts were able to pinpoint the yacht's location at that time. It was behind the island. Shortly after that, Stephen's phone abruptly stopped functioning. There was another curious detail. Before Stephen's death, Harvey had called him dozens of times a week. But after the murder, Harvey never called him again. The police now had enough evidence to arrest Harvey, but they had no idea where he was. All of Harvey's acquaintances claimed that he was likely on the British Virgin Islands, enjoying life on a large yacht among wealthy companions. Finding him would take a miracle. The police reached out to the media and contacted various government agencies, but they couldn't track down the fugitive. Months passed, and detectives believed Harvey had disappeared without a trace, leaving the guilty party unpunished. But on September 11, 2006, nearly 4 months later, officers from Montana reached out to them with new information. A former police officer, now working at a used car dealership, named Joe Parsitich, had called the Montana Sheriff's Office. Some time ago, a man who introduced himself as Harvey Morrow had walked into the dealership looking for a job. He was hired as a salesman. Initially, there were no complaints about him. However, Joe soon noticed that Harvey was making basic errors in calculations, odd for someone who claimed to have been a broker and financial consultant. Joe found this strange, but his suspicions grew when he noticed Harvey's car parked at a cheap motel. This contradicted Harvey's claims about where he lived. Joe couldn't understand why someone would lie about such trivial matters. What truly raised red flags were Harvey's stories about his past. Harvey claimed to own a beautiful home on the Gulf of Mexico, but said he had abandoned everything and moved to Montana after a tragic accident involving his wife. According to Harvey, his wife had been on a yacht with friends when a storm capsized the vessel, and no one survived. The alleged tragedy had left him unable to tolerate being near open water. Joe couldn't shake the feeling that something about the story didn't add up. That evening, he went home and turned to Google, hoping to learn more about the incident involving Harvey's wife. Instead, he found a Denver News article stating that Harvey Morrow was wanted in connection with a murder. The former policeman immediately contacted the sheriff's office. Everyone had assumed Harvey would flee to a tropical locale surrounded by wealthy people. Montana was far from fitting that description, but for a fugitive, it had one strategic advantage. It was close to the Canadian border. Harvey's choice made sense as a clever move. Detectives needed to act with extreme caution, as Harvey could easily cross into Canada if he sensed anything amiss. They relied on Joe to help ensure the arrest was carried out safely and without incident. Given that Stephen had been shot, it was possible Harvey was armed. On the day of the planned arrest, Joe, as the dealership manager, found ways to keep the other salespeople inside the building. When Harvey returned from lunch, Joe asked him to prepare a car for a potential buyer, whom he claimed Harvey had been showing vehicles to earlier. As soon as Harvey stepped outside, Joe called the officers, providing a description of Harvey's appearance and his location. Thanks to this detailed information, the arrest went off without a hitch. Harvey Morrow was quickly and efficiently taken into custody and brought to the local station. During the initial interrogation, Harvey behaved arrogantly, suggesting detectives should direct their questions to Stephen, as if unaware that Stephen's body had been discovered. Ultimately, he demanded a lawyer. Harvey was transferred to Los Angeles to stand trial. Despite the abundance of evidence against him, most of it was circumstantial. The prosecution lacked a crime scene, a murder weapon, or direct witnesses. The case promised to be a challenging one, requiring the prosecution to convince all 12 jurors of Harvey's guilt. In February 2007, the Los Angeles Yacht Club contacted the police. A GPS navigator was found in the yacht club's library, the same model as the manual found on Harvey's yacht. This was the crucial piece of evidence the police had been missing. The navigator revealed that on May 4, 2006, the day of Stephen's murder, Harvey's yacht had left San Pedro, traveled to Santa Catalina Island, reached the backside of the island, circled there for a while, and then quickly returned. The timestamps and movements matched evidence obtained from the cell phone records of Harvey and Stephen. Here's what the police believe happened that May night. Stephen Williams was a kind, open, and extremely trusting man, perhaps too trusting. He believed everything Harvey told him and was eagerly anticipating a wonderful journey. Stephen had been living on the yacht, unaware that it was being renovated with his inheritance. But by the time he realized the truth, it was too late. It's likely that Stephen decided to confront Harvey about his money. When they were behind Santa Catalina Island, Harvey approached Stephen from behind, shot him in the back of the head, and Stephen's body immediately fell overboard. Judging by the GPS navigator, Harvey circled the area briefly, possibly searching for the body, but then, confident in his crime, decided that the ocean currents would take care of the rest and carry the body farther out to sea. He returned to San Pedro and the next day calmly went fishing with a friend. The trial began on May 12, 2011. During the opening statements, Harvey's lawyer made a shocking claim. He presented a promissory note allegedly showing that Stephen's father owed money to Harvey's father. In other words, Harvey hadn't stolen Stephen's money, but had simply been repaid a debt, eliminating any motive for murder. Investigators were confident the note was a forgery, but they needed time to examine the signature. The prosecutor requested the judge annul the trial. The second trial began in October 2011. By then, handwriting experts had compared the signature on the note with Stephen's father's genuine signature. They did not match. The note was a forgery. The prosecutor meticulously demonstrated, check by check, how Harvey had drained Stephen's account, spending nearly $2 million over 3 years to upgrade the yacht. The yacht was never intended for a global voyage as Harvey had promised, but was instead equipped to serve as a lavish showroom to bolster Harvey's image as a successful businessman. In reality, Harvey was no financial consultant, but a con artist. True to his con artist nature, Harvey believed he could talk his way out of the situation and took the witness stand. He claimed that there had been a verbal agreement that Stephen would give him his entire inheritance. In a final insult to Stephen's family and friends, Harvey suggested that Stephen had shot himself. Among Harvey's many victims was his second wife, Deborah. A successful banking consultant, Deborah had no idea for 8 years that her husband was a fraud. She had always dreamed of a global voyage, and Harvey convinced her to sell their home in Texas to buy the yacht. For years, Deborah sent him $12,000 a month, cutting back on her own expenses, while Harvey indulged himself and maintained his false image. After Stephen's murder, Deborah learned the devastating truth. She believes Harvey planned to lure both her and Stephen onto the yacht to kill them both, but Stephen's confrontation accelerated the timeline. She also discovered that her dazzling engagement ring was a cheap fake, just like her husband. After a 6-week trial, the jury found Harvey Morrow guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Harvey Morrow will spend the rest of his life in a cramped prison cell, a fitting punishment for a man who valued freedom, luxury, and comfort above all else. Room 113 in the dormitory of the prestigious Jian School was shared by several girls. All of them were 17, in their final year, and top of their class. The pressure was unreal, studying around the clock, no distractions, only books and discipline. But the girls were close friends. They shared news, joys, and sorrows. That's why what happened one winter night in the middle of the school year came as such a shock. By morning, only one of them was still alive, and her story is stranger than fiction. At the center of this story is Jian School, but this was no ordinary school. Proudly located in Tianjin, China, it had the reputation of being one of the top academic institutions in the country, if not the very best. Students fortunate enough to pass through its gates were destined for the nation's most prestigious universities. But prestige came at a price. All students were required to live on campus, regardless of how close their homes were to the school. Boys and girls lived in separate dormitories, each governed by strict rules and under constant video surveillance. Leaving the dorms was only permitted with written approval from both a teacher and dorm administration. The winter morning of December 23, 1998, at Jian School's dormitory began like any other. The girls were climbing out of their warm beds and hurrying to wash up and prepare for class. But something was preventing the girls from room 112 from getting ready, a strange smell. They stepped into the hallway trying to find the source and realized the odor was seeping from under the door of room 113, their neighboring room. While the others hesitated, unsure of what to do, one girl stepped forward and gently knocked on the door. When there was no response, she gave it a slight push. The door opened easily. The moment the door swung open, the girl was nearly knocked off her feet by a strong, sharp, and overwhelmingly foul odor. Then she saw the bodies. Some of the girls were lying in their beds, others sprawled on the floor, their hair splayed out, arms and legs twisted into the most unnatural positions. It looked like a scene straight out of hell. One girl was curled up in the fetal position. Others lay as if they had collapsed mid-step. What the students saw was blood, urine, vomit, dried foam at the corners of mouths, broken fingernails, and scratch marks on the floor. She screamed in terror. Her friends came running. Some fainted on the spot, others fled in horror. The dormitory supervisor, hearing the commotion upstairs, arrived and saw the same horrifying scene. Fighting back nausea with all her strength, she called the police. Police officers and medics rushed to the scene. The ambulance arrived quickly, but all the victims had been dead for some time. There was nothing anyone could do. Even though emergency personnel had been informed about the nature of the call, they were still shocked by the horrific scene that awaited them in room 113. There were 7 of them, 7 17-year-old girls, roommates, Some of the unfortunate students were lying on their backs, faces twisted in grimaces, their unseeing eyes staring toward the door. Foam covered the mouths of several girls. One girl, lying on her bed, was clutching a doll so tightly that her fingernails had left deep imprints in it. Forensic examiners couldn't even pry her fingers away. Another girl had clearly tried to crawl across the floor. She had scratched at it so violently that her nails had been torn off, leaving raw flesh and blood behind. Under some of the girls, the floor was soiled with excrement, as they had lost control of their bodily functions in death, adding an even more unbearable odor to the room. But the most disturbing part was their eyes. All of their pupils had shrunk to the size of pinpricks. Aside from the bodies, police found fruit in the room, as well as a small knife, presumably used to cut the fruit. There were also cups with a bit of water left in them. The police sent the bodies and the evidence for analysis, determined to find out exactly how the schoolgirls had died. While police officers continued their investigation, they interviewed other students and dormitory staff. That's when they learned that the strange smell had actually appeared the night before. On the evening of December 22nd, around midnight as the girls were getting ready for bed, some of them noticed an odd odor. It didn't resemble the usual smells of a dormitory. It was sharp and chemical. At the time, they couldn't determine its exact source, so they turned to the dorm supervisor. The supervisor also noticed the smell, especially near rooms 113, 112, 111, and 110. But since it was already late, she decided not to disturb the girls in those rooms. Instead, she tried to contact the school administration, but no one answered the phone. So she walked the girls over to the teacher's building, hoping to find someone on duty or to reach their homeroom teacher. That attempt also failed. By the time they returned, it was past 1 a.m. Not wanting the girls to oversleep and miss classes the next day, the supervisor advised them to go to bed. She planned to look into the matter in the morning. Everyone dispersed. And yet, if only they had insisted on opening those few rooms that night, maybe the victims would have had a chance to survive. Surely both the students and the supervisor blamed themselves for not making that decision. But how could they have known? Who would ever expect something like this to happen in a school dormitory? After speaking with the dorm supervisor, the police noticed another detail. Most of the rooms in the dormitory housed 8 students, including room 113. But there were only 7 bodies in the room. Where was the 8th girl? Had she somehow escaped the tragedy, or had she been taken by the perpetrator? No one knew. The police immediately shifted their focus to searching for the missing student. Imagine their astonishment when she appeared on her own. The girl's name was San. After the investigation had already begun, one of her classmates ran into her at the school sports field. While police were searching high and low for her, she had been freely moving around the school. Officers quickly approached San and asked where she had been the previous night. Had she gone anywhere? San innocently replied that she hadn't gone anywhere and had simply slept peacefully in the room. But if she had truly been in that room, she must have known how her roommates died, and yet she insisted she had no idea. The situation grew surreal. Police couldn't believe that she had spent the night in a room where 7 girls died and supposedly knew nothing about it. They spoke with her for a long time, trying to get the truth, but she stubbornly stuck to her story. Finally, the results from the laboratory arrived. They confirmed what investigators had suspected. The girls had been poisoned. However, no one could have imagined what they were poisoned with. The cause of death was organophosphate poisoning, specifically parathion. Parathion, also known as thiophos, is an organophosphate compound, a powerful insecticide that is extremely toxic to humans. It primarily affects the nervous system. The lethal dose is just 2 milligrams. The poison starts to act within 10 minutes, leading to the failure of the muscles involved in breathing, and a deadly amount of fluid builds up in the lungs. Specialists found the pesticide in the victims' digestive systems and vomit, as well as in the cups located at the crime scene. This meant that all 7 girls had ingested the poison in the dormitory. But how could such a toxic pesticide end up in a school dorm? The food in the cafeteria was tested. No toxic substances were found, and access to the cafeteria was restricted to school personnel, so the poisoner couldn't have come from outside. Surveillance footage and school staff also confirmed that no strangers had entered the building that night. That meant the poison could only have been added by someone already inside. And yet, only the girls from room 113 were affected. All the other students in the school were perfectly fine. For understandable reasons, San, who lived in the same room, became the main suspect. Police took her fingerprints and compared them to those found on the cups. Her prints were indeed on all the cups at the crime scene, as well as on the small knife used for cutting fruit. But that alone didn't prove anything. After all, she lived in that room. However, another group of officers managed to uncover a crucial lead. They traced the source of the Parathion to a store that sold it. The shopkeeper clearly remembered the buyer. It's not every day that a high school girl purchases a dangerous chemical. The store employee reported that a half kilogram of Parathion was bought by a high school student. When the police asked him to identify the customer, he immediately pointed to San. All the collected evidence pointed directly at her. But there was one thing the police couldn't understand. Even in diluted form, Parathion has an extremely strong and pungent odor. It's nearly impossible not to notice. Moreover, its toxicity spreads quickly, causing severe pain. If even one girl had ingested the poison a bit earlier than the others, the rest would have noticed immediately, and they would have had time to call for help. The poisoner had to not only make sure all the girls took the poison at the same time, but also prevent anyone nearby from hearing their cries for help. If San was the killer, how did she manage to solve both of these problems? One frail girl against 7. How did she stop them from calling for help? How did she convince them to drink the poison? The police began to suspect that perhaps the immense pressure on the students or some external influence had led the girls to take the poison collectively. But their teachers and classmates insisted that the girls had been cheerful, high-achieving, and had bright futures ahead. There was no way they would do something like that. At the same time, investigators had already confirmed that no one heard sounds of struggle or cries for help that night. It became clear. To get to the truth, they would have to convince San to tell them what really happened. The investigators listed all the evidence they had gathered so far. Tension in the interrogation room was rising. Even though San initially appeared calm and composed, even capable of withstanding intense psychological pressure, she was still just a 17-year-old girl. And finally, the quiet, collected student broke down. She covered her face with her hands, started crying, and began to speak. But the truth she told the police had nothing to do with what they had expected. San admitted that she had indeed purchased the insecticide, but she insisted she did not kill her roommates. Lu did, she said. The name Lu was familiar to the police. She was one of the 7 victims found in room 113. Her cause of death was identical to the others. Could someone be both the killer and a victim at the same time? The police still had serious doubts about San's story, but San said that everything that happened in room 113 was part of a plan by her best friend Lu. Even in such a prestigious school, where classes were always a priority because everything was aimed at excellent exam results and admission to the best universities in China, teenagers remained teenagers. Lu's thoughts hadn't been about lessons for several months. In September 1997, Lu started dating a boy. Such romantic relationships were not approved at school, but that didn't stop the young people. From the day Lu entered the world of romance, it seemed that only her boyfriend existed for her. However, teenage love often turns out to be short-lived. Less than a year passed before the boy broke up with Lu. For her, this news was like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. She tried to save the relationship, but was met with an even harsher rejection from her boyfriend. Of course, Lu shared her feelings with her best friend San, but even sharing her pain with her friend didn't make it go away. She couldn't cope and reached the breaking point where she thought about death. The girl asked San to buy pesticides for her. Most people would never agree to fulfill such a request. So San refused her friend, but Lu insisted, wouldn't leave San alone, constantly describing her suffering after losing her boyfriend. San fell under the influence of Lu's love-blinded mind and reluctantly agreed. The girl seized a moment when she could leave the school, found a store that sold pesticides, and bought a bottle of Parathion. Lu, having obtained the pesticide, suddenly seemed to calm down. She told her friend that she would drink it that very evening, putting an end to the pain caused by her lost love. However, after all the girls in the room had finished their homework and were getting ready to go to bed, Lu unexpectedly changed her mind. No, she didn't change her mind about drinking the Parathion, but she turned to San with an even more absurd request. The girl said that going to another world alone was too lonely. Therefore, she decided that all the roommates would go with her. "You're my best friend. Can you help me one more time?" She shocked San with an even wilder request. This request went beyond all bounds. What had the other girls done besides being unlucky enough to be Lu's roommates? Why should they share her choice? Incredible as it was, San agreed. That very evening, they began to carry out the plan. Lu personally mixed the insecticide with honey and fruit juice to slightly mask its bitter taste and poured a cup for each roommate, except for San. She told her friends that it was medicine her mother had prepared and sent to prevent tuberculosis, which was currently raging in the city. Several cases of the disease had already been registered at school, and 6 students had to go home, missing classes, which could ruin their chances of getting into university. Therefore, all the other students were very afraid of getting sick. When Lou said that her mother, a doctor, had made the medicine for everyone, the girls believed her, willingly took their cups, and even thanked Lou. However, the medicine had a strange smell. The girls couldn't hide their disgust. But Lou waved off their complaints, explaining that all herbal medicines naturally have a strange odor. Saying this, she raised her cup and drank it all down. The other girls stopped grumbling and also drank the medicine, except for San. San explained that she had already drunk her portion at lunch. She watched as the 7 girls, including her best friend, drank the poisonous potion, believing that traditional Chinese medicine would protect them from tuberculosis. The girls didn't leave even a drop in their cups. After that, there was no turning back. The effect of the pesticide appeared very quickly. The process of organophosphate poisoning is incredibly painful. The schoolgirls couldn't bear the hellish pain and began to moan, but San reassured everyone that the pain was a normal reaction to the medicine. When she had taken it during the day, she too had felt discomfort like the others, but soon it passed. San stayed close to her friends, comforting them, urging them to stay calm and not disturb the other girls in the dormitory while sleeping. Incredibly, her words had a magical effect. 6 schoolgirls turned out to be truly kind-hearted people, and despite the terrible pain, they felt it was unacceptable to disturb the others' sleep, so they did not scream. San continued to play the role of the perfect friend. She gave the girls hot water and peeled apples for them, taking care of them as if they were sick. Looking at her at that moment, no one would have guessed that she was a devil watching her roommates die in agony without even raising an eyebrow. Meanwhile, the girls clung to various objects nearby, hoping to endure the pain as San had promised. But even after eating the fruit, their symptoms did not improve at all. On the contrary, the agony intensified. Perhaps they suspected something, but by that time they no longer had the strength to scream. One girl fell from the bed and crawled across the room to the door, scratching the floor with her nails, trying to get out into the corridor and attract someone's attention. But she remained lying on the floor with torn nails, unable to move any further. The poor girl died with wide-open eyes. The lives of the roommates gradually slipped away in a silent struggle. Losing the fight against the terrible poison, they left this world one by one. Sitting nearby, San simply watched what was happening. After all the roommates succumbed to the poison, San just lay down to sleep as if nothing had happened. Just imagine the scene. 7 girls frozen in horrifying poses in a tiny little room. The air was filled with the stench of excrement and vomit. Even thinking about it is enough to make your hair stand on end. Yet San calmly slept on her bed next to her 7 dead friends. When she woke up, she simply stepped over the bodies and went to her classes. The police were shocked by this story. When investigators asked why she didn't just refuse Liu, why she didn't leave when the girls drank the poison, San answered, "She was my best friend. I had to help her." And there was no trace of remorse in her voice. The investigators had no doubt that the girl's story was a hastily concocted lie. San was shifting the blame onto her dead friend, who could no longer defend herself. But an unexpected clue made the detectives reconsider, thinking that this wild story might actually be true. The police found a note from Liu hidden under her bed. They did not disclose the full contents of the note, but Liu explained the reason for her insane act, and it really was love, just as San had said. She also explained why she took all the roommates with her, except San. The note contained words like these: "My dear friend, keep living and enjoying life. I am upset and lack the courage to take you with me. Forgive me for not listening to your advice and for hurting you so much. Everything that happened today is my just punishment. Don't hate or be angry with me." After discovering the note, the police compared the handwriting and confirmed it was written by Liu. Now they had confirmation of San's story. Still, the actions of the surviving girl were beyond rational explanation. To help a friend like that and watch 6 people die, this was beyond any norms. Psychologists suggested that San might be a psychopath. She was simply incapable of empathy. Therefore, she could not truly understand Liu's suffering. Seeing the deaths of her roommates, she felt no fear or guilt. In any case, her criminal actions could not be denied. On December 24, 1998, San was charged. On July 28, 1999, the court delivered its verdict in this case. Taking into account Liu's note and the autopsy results, The court believed that San had purchased the pesticide at Liu's request and helped her commit the crime. Thus, the primary responsibility for the deaths of the 6 girls lay with Liu, while San's role was secondary. However, since her actions were no less shocking, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. The defendant was dissatisfied and tried to appeal the verdict, claiming that she only bought the pesticide and did not know it was poisonous. The judge immediately rejected this claim, stating that the school where the girls studied was known for its excellent education. As a senior student, she could not have been unaware that drinking pesticide could be deadly. San continued to file appeals, but all were denied. The families of the 6 deceased students demanded compensation. They requested 1.5 million Chinese yuan in total, 250,000 yuan for each family. However, the court ruled that each family would receive 1,000 yuan to cover funeral expenses and approximately 50,000 yuan as compensation for the death of their loved ones. Liu's family was ordered to pay 45% of the amount, San's family 30%, and the school would cover the remaining 25%. It seemed the verdict was clear, and the criminal would spend the rest of her life in prison where she belonged. However, thanks to her excellent behavior and the fact that San was a minor at the time of the crime, her sentence was reduced to 15 years. She was released in 2013. Afterwards, she changed her name and disappeared, became a ghost. The only person who knew what really happened that night vanished from sight. It is said she is married, has children, and lives a normal life. To this day, debates continue about whether San was the puppeteer or merely a puppet controlled by Liu's dark resolve. But regardless of who planned the murder, who poured the poison into the cups on that fateful night, 6 innocent girls were denied the justice they deserved. Their names are engraved on gravestones as victims of murder, although they should have entered China's history for a very different reason. Could those girls have imagined that the medicine given by their friend's mother could be a deadly poison? But even more incredible is that someone would not want to die alone and would take all their roommates with them, and all because of a first school love. On March 23, 2015, around 2 p.m., the Vallejo Police Department in California received a call. The man on the line identified himself as Aaron Quinn and reported that his girlfriend had been kidnapped by intruders wearing wetsuits, and he had no idea where they had taken her. Aaron explained that he had also been in the house at the time of the abduction, but was unable to call 911 right away because the intruders had drugged him, blindfolded him, and warned him not to contact the police. Here is what Aaron Quinn told investigators. Around 3 a.m., he and his girlfriend Denise Huskins were awakened by a voice saying,
"Wake up, this is a robbery."
The intruders immediately told them they didn't want to hurt them and were only after money. They ordered Denise to tie Aaron's hands and feet. Then they told her to get into the bedroom closet, face down, and not to look at them. Denise tried not to argue, not wanting to give them a reason to kill her, but she managed to see the legs of several intruders. They tied up Denise and left the 2 of them lying in the closet. But before that, they placed swimming goggles on their eyes, goggles with lenses covered in black tape. They also put headphones over their ears and gave them instructions through pre-recorded messages. Importantly, they addressed Aaron by name, meaning they knew both of their names and the layout of the house. This was a well-organized and carefully planned crime. The criminals said they would give them sleeping pills, and if they refused to take them, they would be injected. They then demanded all of their financial information, warning that if either of them lied, the other would be shocked or have their face slashed. Denise and Aaron complied and answered all of their questions. At one point, however, the intruders seemed to realize they had the wrong couple. One of them asked Aaron if Denise looked like his ex-fiancée. It turned out they hadn't come for Aaron and Denise at all. They were targeting Aaron and his ex. She had moved out recently, and Aaron had just finished moving out the last of her things. The intruders began discussing what to do next. Denise started to hope they might simply leave, but she was wrong. When the apparent leader of the group returned, he announced that they would be taking Denise for 48 hours, so that Aaron could carry out a few tasks for them. The intruders moved Aaron to the couch. They told him a camera had been installed in the room to monitor his every move, and red duct tape had been placed on the floor, walls, and windows to mark the boundary he was not allowed to cross. One of the intruders taped Aaron's ankles and asked if he was comfortable. Aaron replied that he was cold and asked for a blanket. The intruder apologized and said he hadn't realized how cold it was because they were all wearing wetsuits, presumably to avoid leaving any evidence behind. The intruder said he would be giving instructions via email and text. In the morning, Aaron was to call his work and report in sick, then use Denise's phone to message her boss, saying she had a family emergency and would be gone for a week. Finally, the intruder warned Aaron not to use the phone or contact the police. If he did, they would kill Denise. After that, according to Aaron, the intruders put Denise in the trunk of his car and drove off. Using the edge of the couch, Aaron managed to remove the goggles and saw that it was exactly 5 a.m. He tried desperately to stay awake, but the sleeping pills were too strong and he passed out. When the alarm went off in the morning, he called work and messaged Denise's manager. Then he fell asleep again and woke up only around 11:30. Looking around, he saw the red duct tape covering the room. Messages from the kidnappers began to arrive with instructions. They demanded 2 payments of $8,500. So Aaron wouldn't have to withdraw more than $10,000 at a time. Aaron tried to respond to them, but got no reply. That's when he realized he couldn't trust the kidnappers. He needed advice, so he called his brother, an FBI agent. His brother Ethan immediately told him to call the police, because criminals always say not to contact law enforcement, but doing so is essential. Holding his breath, Aaron did exactly what he was told not to do. He called the police. Aaron was sure the police would come to the rescue for him and Denise, but he was in for a major surprise. The first thing the 2 arriving officers asked as they stepped into the house was whether Aaron had taken any drugs, especially illegal ones. Aaron explained that the intruders had forced him to take sleeping pills. Despite this, the officers, without hesitation, disconnected the surveillance camera. Aaron tried to insist that the kidnappers were monitoring him through that very camera, but the detectives didn't listen. They noted that the carpets throughout the house had been meticulously cleaned, and in the bedroom, they found a small blood stain on the bedsheets. After hearing Aaron's account, many aspects of his story seemed strange to them. His car was missing. Denise's phone was in Aaron's possession. He had used it to text her boss, and he had waited quite a long time before finally contacting the police. Experienced officers recognized these as classic red flags of a domestic violence case gone fatally wrong. They took Aaron to the station for questioning. His DNA was collected, and his clothes were taken for forensic analysis. When Aaron repeated his story to Detective Matt Mustard about intruders in diving suits, goggles covered in black duct tape, headphones playing pre-recorded instructions and everything else, Detective Mustard couldn't help but suspect he was fabricating a wild, far-fetched tale. After all, where in real life would you hear something like this? Detective Mustard began questioning Aaron about his relationship with Denise. Aaron explained that he had purchased a house in Mare Island in 2012 and was very proud of such a major purchase. He dreamed of living there for the rest of his life, getting married and raising children. He met Denise at work as they were both physical therapists, experienced professionals who had earned a reputation for being excellent at their jobs. Aaron met Denise during a difficult period in his life. He had just broken up with his fiancée after discovering she had been unfaithful. Like any woman in her position, Denise was a little concerned that Aaron might still have feelings for his ex. Their families liked each other, and although they had been together for 7 months, Denise suspected that Aaron wasn't being completely honest with her about his emotions toward his former fiancée. One day, Denise looked through Aaron's phone and found messages he had sent to his ex, saying that he wanted to get back together with her. Naturally, this deeply upset Denise. For 2 weeks, their relationship was on the verge of breaking up. On Sunday, March 22nd, she told Aaron she would come over to his house. They'd have dinner and talk. That's exactly what happened. She brought pizza, and they spent a long time discussing whether they could rebuild the trust between them. Finally, around midnight, they decided to give their relationship another chance, then went upstairs to sleep. Although Aaron explained that he and Denise had reconciled, the tone of the interrogation began to shift. About 45 minutes in, Detective Mustard bluntly told him he didn't believe a word he was saying. No one had broken into his house wearing scuba suits, he said. Instead, Aaron had killed his girlfriend and hidden her body somewhere. Aaron insisted he was telling the truth, begging them to understand that Denise had been in the hands of kidnappers for hours, and that every minute counted in saving her. Her life could be in danger, but the detectives had already warned Denise's parents to prepare for the worst. They had also started gathering information about Aaron himself to assess whether he had any history of violence. Because this was a kidnapping case, the FBI got involved. One of the agents asked Aaron if he would agree to a polygraph test. Aaron said yes, still cooperating because he desperately needed their help to find Denise. But the agent soon began applying pressure, telling him he had failed the test. Unable to take it anymore, Aaron demanded to speak with a lawyer. After that, the FBI tried another angle. They persuaded Aaron's brother Ethan to talk to him, hoping he might coax a confession out of him. But Aaron simply repeated, word for word, the same story he had told the police. Ethan then contacted a lawyer. The lawyer demanded that Aaron be released if no charges were being filed against him. The lawyer had already begun preparing her client for the likelihood that he would be charged with Denise's murder, when suddenly there was proof that the young woman was still alive. At 12:30 p.m. on March 24th, something incredible happened. The San Francisco Chronicle received a message from the kidnappers.
My name is Denise Huskins, and I'm kidnapped. Earlier today, there was a plane crash in the Alps.
It was Denise's voice, and it was clear that she was still alive, because she referenced an event that had happened that very day. The police immediately wanted to speak with Aaron. When he arrived at the station, they asked if he wanted to respond to the message. Aaron reached for his phone, which had been in police possession this entire time, and noticed it was in airplane mode. That meant it couldn't receive messages or calls. The moment he switched it off, the phone was flooded with dozens of texts. It was hard to believe. The police had put Aaron's phone on airplane mode, even though it was the only line of communication with the kidnappers. If Denise really was being held captive, the very people who were supposed to protect her had effectively cut off the only lifeline. Things became even clearer when Detective Mustard spoke with Denise's relatives. But instead of asking questions aimed at understanding what had happened, his inquiries suggested he believed the whole kidnapping was a hoax. At one point, he asked Denise's mother if anything traumatic had ever happened to her daughter. The woman admitted that, as a teenager, Denise had been molested by an older man during a camping trip. But instead of responding with empathy, Mustard allegedly implied that victims of abuse sometimes seek to relive their trauma or crave attention, though he later denied ever making such a statement. In other words, even after receiving proof that Denise was alive, the police didn't reconsider the possibility that the story might be true. Instead, they doubled down on their theory that the whole thing was an elaborate fake. On Wednesday, March 25th in Huntington Beach, a woman calmly approached a gardener and asked to use his phone. That woman was Denise Huskins. But what was she doing in the city where her parents lived? Where had she been for the past 48 hours? And why did she seem so composed? The police, of course, wanted to speak with her. They were probably expecting to see a distraught kidnapping victim, but instead they saw a calm young woman in sunglasses carrying her bags. She repeated the same story Aaron had told them. She had been drugged and taken from the house. Had she been assaulted? No. Had the kidnappers abused her in any way? Also no. Denise admitted she had been terrified, but claimed the kidnappers had treated her with care. She asked to speak to her parents, but the police kept questioning her. And the questions they asked weren't the kind you'd ask a victim, but a suspect. At one point, her cousin Nick, a lawyer, walked in and took control of the situation. Detective Mustard had allegedly told him that immunity would be offered to whoever confessed first. Denise denied any wrongdoing. It was clear she needed legal protection. The FBI wanted to interrogate her and offered a private jet. But her lawyer, Douglas Rappaport, demanded that she take a commercial flight and come to him immediately. Even before the police had all the facts, the Vallejo Police Department held a massive press conference. In it, they practically accused Denise of staging her own kidnapping and wasting the department's time and resources. It was clear the police had made up their minds. Denise and Aaron were suspects. They accused her of avoiding FBI cooperation, of not boarding their plane, and of disappearing. The highlight of the conference was a statement from a police lieutenant demanding that Denise apologize to the public. The media erupted with the story, painting Denise as a real-life version of the Gone Girl character, a woman who stages her own kidnapping to punish her cheating partner while reveling in the media frenzy. Meanwhile, Denise was on her way to meet her lawyer. When she arrived, she was informed of the shocking press conference. Attorney Douglas Rappaport went over her story again and again. She told him that after she was placed in the trunk, the kidnappers drove her to a house and laid her on the cold concrete floor of a garage, covering her with a blanket. For the first time since her release, she began to feel safe enough to share everything. She confessed that she had initially withheld 2 key details from police. One of the kidnappers had served in the Navy. He had assaulted her. On the first day of her captivity, one of the men told her there was a problem. She wasn't their intended target. That meant they had no leverage to ensure her silence. So one of them would need to sexually assault her on camera to keep her from going to the police. If she did, they would release the footage. Denise admitted the man seemed reluctant, but went through with it. The next day, they told her the footage wasn't convincing enough. This time, she would have to act like she consented to make it more believable. After 2 days, the kidnapper said he was keeping his word. She would be released after 48 hours. In the middle of the night, he put her back in a car. But instead of returning her to Vallejo, where there was now heavy police activity, he dropped her off in Huntington Beach, near where her family lived. He tied a blindfold over her eyes, told her to count to 10 and said, "I admire your strength. I wish we'd met under different circumstances." When she opened her eyes, she was standing alone on a street. Her bags were beside her. Still under the influence of the drugs they had given her, she walked to the corner and suddenly realized this was her childhood neighborhood. She was only minutes from her parents' house. She walked there, hoping for safety and a comforting embrace, but no one was home. Her parents were in Vallejo. She spotted a gardener tending the neighbor's yard and asked to make a call. She left her father a message, then asked the neighbors if she could use their bathroom. When she came back outside, the police were already there. Douglas Rappaport immediately called the Vallejo police and requested a medical examination for Denise. At first, the police ignored the request. Then they told the lawyer to have his client sleep in her clothes and not shower, and that they'd speak to her in the morning. Rappaport explained to Denise that she didn't have to speak with police, but if she didn't, they might never catch her kidnapper. She agreed to cooperate, but the response was hostility and skepticism. Her lawyer was even told outright that she had staged the kidnapping herself. On Thursday, March 26th, the San Francisco Chronicle received another email containing a wealth of details about the kidnapping. The author wrote that it wasn't a staged event and that neither Denise nor Aaron were lying. The case was becoming increasingly surreal. The kidnappers were offended that the police and FBI didn't believe Denise and Aaron, and they were eager for recognition of their crime. They even included a photo of the room where they had kept Denise. The kidnappers wrote that, in addition to the kidnapping, they had committed several other crimes on Mare Island. They also admitted that they had started as car thieves, but made little money, so they turned to kidnappings for ransom. They referred to themselves as gentlemen thieves. The email arrived at the same time the police were questioning Denise, so one might have thought that this information would serve as her justification, compelling the police and agents to reconsider their stance. But no. Weeks passed, and there were no breakthroughs in the case, probably because the police were convinced there was nothing to investigate. In their opinion, the criminals were Denise and Aaron. The young couple was on the verge of being arrested at any moment. They lost their prestigious jobs, and people hated them, sending them terribly offensive messages. But soon a breakthrough in the case occurred, one that could change everything. On June 5, 2015, nearly 2 months after the described events, the Dublin police received a report of a home invasion. In the middle of the night, the couple was awakened by the bright light of a flashlight shining in their faces. In general, it started out like the attack in Vallejo, but this time things quickly went awry. When the intruder tried to tie up the wife, the man jumped over the bed and tackled the stranger. The woman ran to the bathroom and dialed 911. The intruder managed to fend off the homeowner and escape, but during the struggle, he dropped his phone. The phone led the Dublin police to Matthew Moeller. Matthew had served in the Navy and left with honors. The phone led them to Matthew Moeller. He had served in the Navy and left with honors, graduated from college summa cum laude, and went on to study law at Harvard. He got married, and a bright future lay ahead of him. But in 2008, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and by 2015, his life had completely spiraled. He lost his job, his wife, and now lived in a remote family cabin. On June 8th, the Dublin police arrived at Matthew's cabin with a search warrant. Among them was Misty Caruso, who had only a few days left before officially becoming a detective. But when her boss asked if she would go on the search for the new case, she agreed. Matthew's cabin was filthy. When he was arrested, he didn't resist at all. During the search, Misty immediately had a strange feeling about the place. There were ski masks, stun guns, phones, laptops, and Matthew was driving a stolen Mustang, where they found duct tape, zip ties, a gun with a laser attached by duct tape, and diving goggles with taped-over lenses. Notably, one of the lenses had a white hair stuck to it. However, the homeowners in Dublin were brunettes. Misty realized something terrible had happened, but she still didn't know who the victim was. Misty continued to dig deeper. There was plenty of evidence of an attempted robbery in Dublin, and she could have stopped there, but the case wouldn't leave her mind. Misty traced the rightful owner of the stolen Mustang, who turned out to be a student from Mare Island. The young man mentioned that at the same time his car was stolen, a kidnapping occurred, a kidnapping that the Vallejo police had dismissed as a hoax. Misty remembered this high-profile case and contacted the Vallejo police, telling them about the possible suspect. A police officer from Dublin and 2 FBI agents arrived at the station. After reviewing the collected evidence, they were shocked. All of Denise and Aaron's statements were confirmed, and it turned out their story wasn't as unbelievable as they'd thought. In Matthew's car, they found a GPS device, and among the saved addresses was Huntington Beach in Utica, the very clue that matched the location where the kidnappers had dropped off Denise. In addition to the previously described evidence, police found several drones that the criminals had used to observe Aaron's neighborhood. It was also discovered that they had secretly placed several cameras to monitor his house. Matthew was not charged with sexual assault, but with kidnapping for ransom, because federal court lacks jurisdiction over such crimes. Matthew pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 40 years in prison, although he filed an appeal. He did not give up his accomplices, although Denise and Aaron are convinced that Matthew did not act alone during the kidnapping. Naturally, once the full truth about the case came to light, many questions were raised about the Vallejo police. Perhaps if the police had listened to Aaron and hadn't put his phone on airplane mode, they would have reached Denise much sooner, because, as it turned out, the kidnappers had called him 3 times. They had all the necessary evidence in hand to locate, or at least attempt to locate, the criminal, which could have prevented the Dublin attack. However, the Vallejo police never publicly apologized to the young couple. Even more shocking, Detective Mustard was awarded Officer of the Year in 2015. It's no surprise that Denise and Aaron filed a civil lawsuit against the police. The case was settled out of court, and they received $2.5 million. Soon after, Aaron proposed to Denise. The couple held a beautiful wedding ceremony attended by their 2 lawyers in Misty Carrasco, the woman who found the criminal and helped restore Denise's good name. Not long after, the couple became parents. When asked whether they will tell their daughter what happened, Denise says yes. No matter how difficult their story was, it is a love story, one that led to the birth of their daughter.